Jürgen Habermas, From Hitler Youth to Democracies, Philosopher, One Man's Journey from Silence to Truth. Born with a speech impediment, he became the most articulate defender of rational communication in modern philosophy. The boy who struggled to form words would dedicate his life to understanding how language shapes human freedom. Jürgen Habermas entered the world on June 18, 1929, in Düsseldorf, Germany, at a moment when the Weimar Republic teetered on the edge of collapse. His father served as director of the local seminary in Gummersbach, a small town in the Rhineland where the family settled. The congenital cleft palate that marked young Jürgen's face also shaped his voice, giving him a distinctive speech pattern that would remain throughout his 96 years. Like millions of German boys, 10-year-old Habermas joined the Hitler Youth. The organization was less a choice than an inevitability in a society increasingly consumed by National Socialism. His father's involvement with the Nazi regime created an atmosphere of complicity that the young philosopher would later struggle to understand. In 1944, at just 15 years old, Habermas was sent to the Western Front during the war's desperate final months. He witnessed the collapse of the Third Reich from within its crumbling military machine. The end came in May 1945, bringing not celebration but revelation. When the Nuremberg trials exposed the full horror of Nazi atrocities, Habermas experienced what he later described as a profound transformation. The images from the concentration camps, the testimony of survivors, the documented evidence of systematic genocide, all of it shattered whatever remained of his childhood worldview. This confrontation with evil would become the foundation of his philosophical project. How could rational people commit such crimes? How could an entire society embrace barbarism? These questions would drive his lifelong commitment to understanding democracy, communication, and the conditions for genuine human freedom. The young man who emerged from the war's ruins was hungry for understanding. Habermas completed his secondary education and embarked on an intellectual journey that would take him across multiple universities. From 1949 to 1950, he studied at Göttingen, then moved to Zurich for a year before settling at the University of Bonn from 1951 to 1954. This peripatetic education exposed him to diverse philosophical traditions and methods. At Bonn, he worked under Erich Rothacker and Oskar Becker, completing his doctoral dissertation on Friedrich Schelling in 1954. The thesis, titled The Absolute and History on the Ambivalence of Schelling's Thought, revealed Habermas' early interest in the relationship between philosophy and historical change. But the dissertation was merely preparation for what would become his true intellectual awakening. In 1953, while still a graduate student, Habermas published a bold critical essay in the prestigious Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. The target was Martin Heidegger, widely considered Germany's greatest living philosopher. Habermas confronted Heidegger over his Nazi sympathies and his refusal to adequately address his collaboration with the regime. The essay marked the young scholar as someone willing to challenge authority and demand moral accountability. From 1956 to 1959, Habermas worked as research assistant to Theodor Adorno at the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt. This position connected him directly to the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, the intellectual movement that would shape his career. Under Adorno's mentorship, he encountered a sophisticated critique of modern society that went beyond traditional Marxism. Yet even then, Habermas was developing his own distinctive approach. Where Adorno saw only domination and despair in modernity, Habermas began to glimpse possibilities for rational communication and democratic progress. Chapter 3. The Public Sphere Emerges. In 1961, Habermas completed his habilitation thesis at the University of Marburg under political scientist Wolfgang Abendroth. The work would be published the following year as The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere, a book that would fundamentally reshape how scholars understood democracy and civil society. The concept was deceptively simple, yet profoundly radical. Habermas traced the emergence of a bourgeois public sphere in 18th-century Europe, a space between the state and private life where citizens could gather, debate, and form public opinion. Coffeehouses, salons, and newspapers created venues for rational, critical debate about matters of common concern. This public sphere, Habermas argued, was essential to democratic legitimacy. But the book was also a lament. Habermas documented how this vibrant public sphere had been eroded by the rise of mass media, consumer culture, and the manipulation of public opinion. The space for genuine democratic deliberation was shrinking, replaced by manufactured consensus and passive consumption. The publication in 1962 coincided with Habermas' appointment as extraordinary professor at the University of Heidelberg. His academic career was accelerating rapidly. Just 2 years later, in 1964, he achieved a milestone that confirmed his arrival as a major intellectual force. At age 35, Habermas succeeded Max Horkheimer as professor of philosophy and sociology at Johann Wolfgang Goethe University, Frankfurt. The symbolism was unmistakable. Horkheimer, along with Adorno, had founded the Frankfurt School and shaped its first generation. Now Habermas would lead its second generation in new directions. He accepted the responsibility of inheriting this tradition while also transforming it. Unlike his predecessors' deep pessimism about the Enlightenment and modernity, Habermas believed that reason still held emancipatory potential. The question was how to realize it. The year 1968 brought upheaval across Europe and America. Students occupied universities, workers struck, and young people demanded radical change in everything from politics to personal relationships. In Germany, the student movement challenged the generation that had lived through and enabled Nazism. Habermas, still in his 30s, might have been expected to embrace this youthful rebellion. Instead, he became one of its most prominent critics. During heated debates with student protesters, he used a phrase that would haunt him for years: left-wing fascism. The term ignited a firestorm of controversy. How could a progressive intellectual compare radical students to fascists? Habermas later acknowledged the phrase was poorly chosen, but he stood by his underlying concern. He saw in some student activists an authoritarian impulse, a willingness to use violence and abandon democratic procedures in pursuit of revolutionary goals. This was precisely the kind of thinking that had enabled the Nazi catastrophe he had witnessed as a youth. The commitment to democratic norms and rational discourse could not be suspended, even for noble ends. The means, Habermas insisted, were inseparable from the ends. The controversy revealed a central tension in his thought. He was deeply critical of existing capitalist democracies and their injustices. Yet he refused to abandon the institutions and procedures of democratic deliberation. Revolution, if it came, must come through communication and consensus, not violence and coercion. Many students felt betrayed by someone they had considered an ally. But Habermas saw his position as the only one consistent with his philosophical principles. The episode demonstrated his willingness to stand alone when he believed fundamental values were at stake. It was a pattern that would repeat throughout his long career as a public intellectual. Chapter 5. Starnberg, and system building. In 1971, Habermas made a surprising move. He left his prestigious position at Frankfurt to become director of the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Living Conditions in the Scientific and Technical World in Starnberg, near Munich. The decade he spent there, from 1971 to 1981, proved to be his most productive period of theoretical work. The institute provided ideal conditions for sustained intellectual labor. Freed from heavy teaching duties, Habermas could focus on developing the comprehensive social theory he had been building toward for years. He assembled a talented research team and engaged in intensive interdisciplinary work. The result was his magnum opus, The Theory of Communicative Action, published in 2 volumes in 1981. The work synthesized insights from philosophy, sociology, linguistics, and psychology into a unified framework. At its center was a revolutionary idea about rationality itself. Traditional philosophy had located rationality in individual consciousness or in the relationship between mind and nature. Habermas argued instead that rationality was fundamentally communicative. It emerged from the structures of interpersonal linguistic communication. When people engage in genuine dialogue, they implicitly accept certain validity claims, that what they say is true, that they are sincere, and that their speech is appropriate to the context. This communicative rationality provided the foundation for both ethics and democracy. Moral norms could be justified through rational discourse in which all affected parties participated as equals. Democratic legitimacy required institutions that approximated this ideal speech situation. The theory also introduced influential distinctions between system and life world. Modern societies, Habermas argued, contained both communicatively structured domains of everyday life and strategically organized systems like the economy and state bureaucracy. Problems arose when these systems colonized the life world, replacing communication with instrumental manipulation. In 1983, Habermas returned to the University of Frankfurt as professor of philosophy and sociology. He had completed his major theoretical work and was ready to re-engage more directly with public debates. The timing proved fortuitous, as Germany was about to enter one of its most contentious intellectual controversies. The Historiker Streit, or historians' debate, erupted in the mid-1980s over how Germans should understand their Nazi past. Conservative historians argued that the Holocaust, while terrible, should be seen in the context of other 20th-century atrocities, including Stalin's crimes. They suggested that excessive focus on German guilt was preventing the nation from developing a healthy national identity. Habermas entered the debate with characteristic force. In a series of essays and public interventions, he argued that any attempt to normalize or relativize the Holocaust was morally and intellectually bankrupt. The Nazi genocide was unique in its systematic, bureaucratic, industrial character. More importantly, confronting this past honestly was essential to German democracy. He introduced the concept of constitutional patriotism as an alternative to ethnic nationalism. Germans could be proud of their democratic constitution and political culture rather than basing identity on blood and soil. This was a patriotism grounded in universal values rather than particular traditions. The controversy made Habermas a household name in Germany. His intervention was widely credited with shifting public opinion and preventing a revisionist interpretation of the Holocaust from gaining mainstream acceptance. It demonstrated the power of intellectual engagement in shaping political culture. Throughout this period, Habermas continued his scholarly work. He refined his discourse ethics, engaged with critics, and extended his analysis to new domains. His productivity seemed limitless, with books, essays, and lectures flowing in a steady stream. Students and colleagues marveled at his ability to combine rigorous theoretical work with timely public intervention. Chapter 7. Between Facts and Norms. In 1992, Habermas published Between Facts and Norms, Contributions to a Discourse Theory of Law and Democracy. The massive work applied his communicative theory to questions of legal and political legitimacy. It would become one of the most influential contributions to democratic theory in the late 20th century. The book grappled with a fundamental tension. Law operates through coercion and formal procedures, facts. Yet democratic law also claims to embody moral principles and collective self-determination, norms. How could these two dimensions be reconciled? Habermas argued that legitimate law must be understood as the result of rational discourse among free and equal citizens. Democratic procedures were not merely pragmatic compromises, but embodied moral principles of mutual respect and inclusion. The legitimacy of law depended on the quality of the deliberative process that produced it. This deliberative model of democracy challenged both liberal and republican traditions. Against liberals who saw democracy primarily as aggregating pre-existing preferences, Habermas emphasized how public deliberation could transform preferences and create genuine consensus. Against republicans who emphasized shared values and common good, he insisted on the pluralism of modern societies and the need for procedures that could generate legitimate norms despite deep disagreements. The book appeared at a crucial moment. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and German reunification in 1990 had raised urgent questions about democracy and national identity. Across Eastern Europe, new democracies were being established. Habermas' work provided theoretical resources for thinking about these transitions. He had retired from his Frankfurt professorship in 1994, but retirement proved to be merely a change in status rather than activity. He continued teaching at Northwestern University and New York University, lectured worldwide, and maintained an exhausting schedule of writing and public engagement. Age seemed only to increase his productivity. Recognition of Habermas' contributions came from around the world. In 2003, he received the Prince of Asturias Award in Social Sciences. The following year brought the Kyoto Prize in Arts and Philosophy, one of the most prestigious international honors. In 2005, he was awarded the Holberg International Memorial Prize, worth approximately €520,000. But Habermas valued influence over honors. He remained deeply engaged in contemporary political debates, bringing philosophical principles to bear on urgent issues. He was a prominent critic of the Iraq War, arguing that it violated principles of international law and democratic deliberation. He wrote extensively on European integration, defending a vision of a democratic European federation against both nationalist critics and technocratic centralization. Genetic engineering and biotechnology raised new ethical questions. In his book, The Future of Human Nature, Habermas argued that genetic enhancement threatened the conditions for autonomous selfhood. If our genetic makeup was determined by others' choices rather than natural lottery, it could undermine our sense of being authors of our own lives. He also engaged seriously with religion, a surprising development for a secular thinker. While maintaining his own non-religious worldview, Habermas argued that secular citizens should recognize religious traditions as potential sources of moral insight. His dialogues with Cardinal Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict XVI, demonstrated his willingness to engage across deep philosophical divides. In 2007, the Times Higher Education Guide listed him as the 7th most cited author in the humanities and social sciences. His work had been translated into more than 40 languages and influenced disciplines from philosophy to communication studies. In 2015, he shared the John W. Kluge Prize for Achievement in the Study of Humanity with philosopher Charles Taylor, receiving $1.5 million. The prize recognized his lifetime contribution to understanding human society and culture. Chapter 9. Final Interventions. Even in his 90s, Habermas refused to retreat from public debate. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, he published essays analyzing the crisis through the lens of international law and democratic values. He argued for strong European support for Ukraine while warning against escalation that could lead to nuclear catastrophe. The Israel-Hamas war that erupted in 2023 prompted similarly careful interventions. Habermas condemned Hamas terrorism while also criticizing Israeli settlement policies and the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. He sought to apply universal principles consistently, refusing to let political allegiances override moral reasoning. In 2024, at age 95, he received the Johann Skytte Prize in Political Science, often called the Nobel Prize of Political Science. The award recognized his transformative contributions to democratic theory and political philosophy. It was a fitting capstone to a career spanning 7 decades. That same year, he donated additional materials from his preliminary legacy to Frankfurt University Library, building on an earlier donation in 2011. The archive contained correspondence, drafts, and notes documenting the development of his thought. It would provide resources for scholars studying his work for generations. Habermas spent his final years near Lake Starnberg, the area where he had done his most important theoretical work decades earlier. The location held personal significance, a place where he had wrestled with fundamental questions about reason, communication, and democracy. He continued to write and speak out on political issues until near the end. On March 14, 2026, Jürgen Habermas died at age 96. News of his death prompted tributes from around the world. Political leaders, fellow philosophers, and ordinary citizens recognized the passing of one of the 20th century's most important thinkers. He had lived long enough to see his ideas shape democratic movements and institutions across continents. Habermas' legacy extends far beyond his published works, vast as they are. He fundamentally changed how we think about democracy, moving it from a system of voting to a process of deliberation. His concept of the public sphere became essential to understanding civil society and political legitimacy. The theory of communicative action provided a new foundation for critical social theory. By locating rationality in communication rather than individual consciousness, Habermas opened new possibilities for thinking about reason, morality, and social coordination. His discourse ethics offered a way to ground moral principles without appealing to metaphysics or tradition. Perhaps most importantly, Habermas defended the unfinished project of modernity and Enlightenment values when they were under attack from multiple directions. Against postmodern skeptics who rejected universal reason, he argued that communicative rationality was both real and essential to human freedom. Against neoconservatives who saw only decline, he insisted that modernity contained resources for its own self-correction. His influence shaped multiple disciplines. Sociologists use his concepts to analyze social movements and institutional change. Legal scholars draw on his work to understand constitutional democracy. Communication theorists employ his framework to study media and public discourse. Political philosophers continue to debate and extend his deliberative model of democracy. As a public intellectual, Habermas embodied the ideal of the engaged scholar. He consistently applied philosophical principles to real-world issues, from genetic engineering to European integration to military intervention. He demonstrated that abstract theory could illuminate practical politics without losing its rigor. The boy with the cleft palate, who struggled to speak clearly, became the most articulate defender of rational communication in modern philosophy. The teenager who witnessed the Nazi catastrophe dedicated his life to understanding how democracy and reason could prevent such horrors. Jürgen Habermas left the world a richer theoretical inheritance and a more robust democratic culture.